Please welcome to the stage Dr. Tryphinia Peel-Edie.
Colleagues and friends, good afternoon. It's the 2022 annual meeting of the American Educational Research Association, and it is good to see you all in person. And welcome to those participating virtually. I trust you all have enjoyed yourselves tremendously this week. This afternoon, we get to continue the conversation, critically engaging ideas and visions about ways to cultivate equitable education systems for the 21st century. In just a moment, Dr. Naila Sawad Nasir is going to deliver her 2022 presidential address. So prepare yourselves for this memorable and reinvigorating experience. I am Dr. Tryphinia Peel-Edie, Associate Professor in the Department of Language, Literacy, and Sociocultural Studies in the College of Education and Human Sciences at the University of New Mexico. And this year's co-program chair with Dr. Elizabeth Tipton, Associate Professor in the Department of Statistics and Faculty Fellow in the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. Beth, please stand. On our behalf, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker of the hour, the 2022 President of the American Educational Research Association and 6th President of the Spencer Foundation, Dr. Naila Sawad Nasir. Dr. Nasir earned her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. She has held faculty appointments in the School of Education at Stanford University and the University of California, Berkeley, where she was Gene Williams Chair of African American Studies and Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion. She's also a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of AERA and the Spencer Foundation. Her scholarship examines the racialized and cultural nature of learning and schooling, and these in connection to inequality and inequity. She publishes and lectures extensively about these issues nationally and internationally. Her book, Racialized Identities, Race and Achievement for African American Youth, is a must-read, as well as her most recent publication with colleagues Carol D. Lee, Roy P., and Maxine McKinney de Royston, The Handbook of the Cultural Foundations of Learning. She is a renowned scholar, researcher, thinker, leader, and change maker. In fact, you might find it interesting to know that Naila's leadership development began in her early years. The middle of 3 siblings, she began talking at 9 months old, and not too long after that, according to her mother, put herself in charge of her 2 sisters, older sister Denisha and younger sister Estrella. I learned also from her mother that in the interest of justice, in elementary school, Naila once hit a classmate with her shoe because he was bullying her friend. Can you imagine this adorable bundle of sweetness doing such a thing? Fortunately, her approach has developed over the years, but her passion and commitment to the cause has remained steadfast. Incidentally, she did get in trouble for inappropriately using her shoe for such a purpose back then. I have so many stories, but too little time to share all the illustrations of Naila's courage and selflessness, her tenacious and loyal advocacy for others, her fearless leadership, and the incredible legacy she has established for all who know her and have been inspired by her. I am among them. But I think a word from someone who experienced her early leadership and sphere of influence firsthand is especially fitting in this moment. Please welcome to the stage Naila's little sister, Estrella Dawson.
Thank you, Tryphinia, for that very fitting introduction, and let me tell you all why it is so fitting. Naila is 1 year older than me, and for most of elementary school and middle school, Naila's little sister was literally my name. In the hallway, on the playground, it was, "Hey, Naila's little sister, aren't you Naila's little sister?" And when I would arrive to meet my teacher on the first day of school, my teacher would say, "Oh, wow, you're Naila's little sister. I expect great things from you." So Naila left big shoes for me to fill, even in those days. Her pursuit of excellence and the impact she left on people and spaces started early. As a big sister, she has always challenged me to be better, encouraged me, believed in me, and protected me. So much so that in 7th grade, not only did she make a boy stop bullying me, she made him apologize for his behavior. Naila, years ago you left big shoes for me to fill, and today you leave big shoes for all of us to fill. I love you, I am so incredibly proud of you and all that you have accomplished, and it has been an honor and a privilege to be your sister on this journey.
Alas, in addition to her phenomenal trajectory as a scholar and leader, Naila is a devoted daughter, sister, mother, auntie, mentor, and friend and colleague to me. Friend, congratulations on a successful presidential year and all of your accomplishments. Now, without further delay, AERA, please join us in welcoming and saluting our 2022 AERA President, Dr. Naila Sawad Nasir.
Good afternoon. Leave it to your friends and family to make you cry before the biggest talk of your life. That was really beautiful. Thank you. Thank you both. I want to begin by acknowledging that we stand upon the land of the Kumeyaay people. They are a people whose traditional lifeways intertwine with a worldview of earth and sky in a community of living beings. As we acknowledge this legacy from the Kumeyaay, we promote this balance in life as we pursue our goals of knowledge and understanding. What an honor it has been to be president of AERA this year. So grateful for my brilliant co-chairs, Tryphinia Peel-Edie and Beth Tipton, and the amazing work of our honorary program co-chair, Naomi May, who you may have all gotten emails from if you were in a presidential session. You all were a dream team. Special thank you to the AERA staff, Robert, Lori, Nathan, Norm, Kendra, and of course, the indomitable Executive Director, Felice Levine. You all pulled off a flawless meeting in some very difficult times with some very complex pieces. So many more thank yous I could extend, but we have shortened this session to only an hour, so I'm going to get right to it. The title of my talk today is A Vision for the Future of Learning, and at the core of my talk is this central concern. How do we organize education and learning systems for a multicultural democracy? How do we build systems that transcend and transform how we have been doing education, and that are designed to support rich and engaging learning, critical thinking skills, and to fully educate young people in ways that honor their whole humanity, their developmental needs, and their families and communities? I see this talk as building explicitly upon the presidential talks over the last several years. In 2019, Amy Stuart Wells focused on education policy and the ways that our commitment as a nation to standardized testing and accountability has contributed to what she called the new Jim Crow of education. In 2020, Vanessa Settle-Walker traced the history of the connection between AERA and the National Education Association and described the research traditions and connections with practitioners and community that we gained when the Black teacher organizations merged with NEA in 1966, but were lost to AERA when NEA and AERA split in 1968. In 2021, Sean Harper's talk issued a call to action about our role as an education research community to take responsibility for how our work is used and how our field disrupts or perpetuates the very systems that we study, and also to take seriously our ethical commitments to each other and to a more just world. I will build on my colleagues' great thinking, taking seriously that education has continued to perpetuate inequity with the accountability era as the most recent iteration, and considering how the way we do our work as an education research community needs to build on the insights of and be accountable to stakeholders outside of our research world. And this new way of working together should occur in the service of creating learning systems that support human wholeness and thriving. I want to start by defining the terms I use in the title. First, vision. A vision is about creating a blueprint for something that does not yet exist, imagining something we cannot yet see. In that spirit, this talk is about what we can imagine together for learning spaces. But it is also a vision rooted in the wisdom of the past, in the glimpses of the powerful spaces for learning and being that have always existed, informally, in snippets sometimes, across cultures and communities. Future. Here I mean the common sense notion of the future, something off on the horizon that is not here yet. The future is what we steward for generations to come, our children, grandchildren, and human kin of no relation. I also think here about the work in African American, Indigenous, and queer futurity, and the ways that it signifies more than just a time space not here yet, but also hope, optimism, joy, possibility. Learning. Some of you know I started my career under the mentorship of Jeff Sachs, who's watching online, studying cognition in out-of-school learning spaces. So for me, learning has always meant something beyond school. Learning is a natural act. It's what babies do as their human inheritance. Interact with the environment and learn to be and do in relation to their caregivers and the community around them. And learning also has a meaning as a part of the Black tradition, where the seeking of knowledge, the act of learning, was a radical act, an act of self-determination, of community uplift. And so the question isn't, how do we get people to learn? People always have and always will learn. The question is, how do we make our educational systems humane and connecting places that provide enriching forms of learning, the kind that contribute to civically minded, empowered, joyful, generous, and intellectually engaged people? So I'm going to begin with a few grounding ideas, and then I'm going to make 3 key points over the course of the talk. 1, that we can theorize learning in ways that respects diversity and multiplicity and supports people's thriving. 2, that we can transform equitable education and learning systems to provide access to robust learning. And 3, that we can use our research expertise in ways that support these equitable systems if we do our work in some new ways. This talk is about hope and imagining something different. Hope in the radical tradition of bell hooks and others. But I want to make clear that while I will be focused on hope and a vision of what we could build, I do so fully mindful of the issues of power that underlie learning, as well as how power and privilege reproduce themselves in our current system. Many in this room have done great work on this. We know that these structures of power are not easy to change, and they resist and morph. At the same time, I am aware of the power of a people who want something different for the next generation, and of the power we hold individually and collectively as the education research community. And I am suggesting that we not cede our power, rather that we garner it and use it collectively for good. Education, and in particular the education of Black folks and other marginalized communities, has always been a contentious endeavor in this country. On one hand, schools have been a social mobility mechanism, whereby Black people have used education as a means to better their material conditions, personally and as a community. On the other hand, the historical and contemporary record shows that schools were designed to be an unequal system. Under segregation, Black schools were vastly underfunded and under-resourced. There was a brief period in the late 70s and 1980s where racial disparities in schooling experiences and outcomes improved during the time of the implementation of desegregation, such as it was, and they have been steadily worse in the decades since. However, when we look more closely, we find that there are important lessons to be gained about teaching and learning from the period of schooling in Black communities in the era of segregation. Scholarship by educational historians, Jim Anderson, Vanessa Seidel-Walker, Jarvis Given's new book, have documented Black schools where teachers and administrators held high expectations for students, where pedagogy was rooted in love, and where there was deep and abiding connections between schools, families, and communities. This work also revealed the belief in learning as a means to liberation, as a means to both psychological and actual freedom, as important to developing one's own, as Vanessa Seidel-Walker put it, highest potential. We can learn from these rich traditions. These were schools that centered wholeness, identity, and the connections between academic content, intellectual development, and commitment to community and nation. And this is more necessary now than ever. In her new book, The Trayvon Generation, Elizabeth Alexander focuses in on the experiences of Black young people who have grown up in the era of police killings and the very public violence towards Black men, women, and youth. She beautifully articulates the developmental needs, without using that term, of this generation of young people, the mental health needs, the deep and wide experience of trauma, the lack of trust in institutions and systems, the need to be seen and heard, and for wholeness to be stewarded. Building the systems we need in this moment holds some challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only wreaked havoc, isolation, illness, loss of loved ones, depression in so many lives, it has also heightened and deepened our awareness of what many have called the three other pandemics of our time: systemic racism, the climate catastrophe, and the economic crisis. In this context, we have seen educational inequity also deepen. We've seen the effects of existing inequities become even more extreme. Our time is marked by these crises, resulting in the deepening of long-term societal fissures, astronomical student loan debt, housing insecurity, and the decline of public institutions and infrastructure. In education, we've seen academic and emotional effects of the pandemic on students, bitter conflicts over so-called critical race theory and the rights of trans students, and ongoing efforts to privatize public educational resources. What is clear is that past solutions will not serve us to have the future we want. These challenging times may be creating the desire, the demand, and the readiness for something else, an opening for us to imagine something new. Gloria Ladson-Billings has talked about this as a moment of possibility we may not see again in our lifetime. Our collective future depends upon an opening up of opportunity, transforming systems that have perpetuated inequity and oppression, and finding a new way, supporting people and communities to develop their highest potential. But in order to realize the power of this moment, we must change our frame. Heather McGhee recently wrote this book called The Sum of Us, in which she looks over time at several major public issues: access to good jobs and pensions, purchasing a home, clean air, access to high-quality schools. And for each issue, she notes how racism, at key moments in history, prevented an opening of access, right at the point where it would have served Black folks or folks from other marginalized groups. And in thus closing down the access for Black people, access was also shut down for poor whites, for women, for others who might benefit, thus creating structures that worked against the goal of having a prosperous society. Her point is that everyone loses when we double down on inequality, both materially and psychologically. One of the greatest lies is that supporting one group comes at the cost of the well-being of other groups. She writes, "The task ahead, then, is to unwind this idea of a fixed quantity of prosperity and replace it with what she's come to call solidarity dividends, gains available to everyone when they unite across racial lines in the form of higher wages, cleaner air, and better funded schools." This is a profound argument for multiplicity, for creating systems that provide many ways for folks to succeed and to thrive. And it must be at the base of how we imagine the kinds of education and learning systems that are possible. So, as I said, I'm going to make 3 points. 1, we can theorize learning in ways that respects diversity and multiplicity and supports people's thriving. I've learned it's good to repeat because y'all are tired. This is day 5. It's been a long conference. We can build equitable education and learning systems that provide access to robust learning. 3, we can use our research expertise in ways that supports equitable systems if we do our work in some new ways. First, I want to take up the first point and consider how we theorize learning for a multicultural democracy. And at the core is to understand learning as a culturally rooted and whole person endeavor. How we theorize the nature of learning has direct implications for the ways we teach, how we arrange classrooms and other learning settings, and how we organize schools. We've theorized learning in 3 waves over historical time in our field. Behaviorism, which conceived of learning as the accumulation of facts and skills learned through processes of reinforcement, think rote memorization and recital. Cognitivism saw learning as the storage, retrieval, and processing of information, and saw teaching as cultivating active exploration in the service of real-world tasks, think project-based learning. Sociocultural theory viewed learning as transformations of participation and identity, coupling learning how to know and do with learning how to be. From this perspective, teaching must attend to the social routines and connections that support learning, think collaborative group work. Each of these theories contributes partial truths. What we really need, though, is a theory of learning that integrates these insights and holds at core a holistic perspective of learning and of young people. And there is another problem from the prior science that we need to attend to. What is required is a science of learning that takes multiplicity, difference, and cultural context very seriously. This has not been our history as a field. You've heard of the weird problem? Our science is built on a focus on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people, weird people. 96% of studies in psychology are conducted with weird samples, even though those people reflect only 12% of the population. Megan Bang notes, this broad-scale sample bias results in a field-level flattening of our understandings of human diversity and cultural variation. As a result of the lack of diversity in samples and researchers, scientific instruments and measures of intelligence have often projected deficit conceptions across cultural communities, with Western researchers presuming their own frames of reference as the universal norm. In other words, we need to better attend to cultural diversity with our science, and to not do so leaves us at risk, A, for bad science, and for science rooted in deficit theories and misunderstandings. Many in the field of the learning sciences have been working to elaborate more nuanced alternatives to these approaches in studies of learning. My colleagues, Carol Lee, Roy P., Maxine McKinney de Royston, and I recently edited the Handbook of the Cultural Foundations of Learning. It was one of those 10 years in the making kind of projects, which brought together wonderful thinkers to reflect on what we know about learning from studies that take strengths that exist in communities to heart, and which don't essentialize learning in reductive ways. Out of this volume emerged the RISE principles of learning, which contend that learning is one rooted in the evolutionary, biological, and neurological systems of our bodies and minds, and inseparable from social and cultural activities. 2, learning is integrated with all other aspects of development, including cognition, emotion, and the formation of identity, to establish a wide-angle view of the whole child. 3, learning is shaped by everyday life and cultural activities, both in and out of school and across the lifespan, and learning is experienced in our bodies through coordination with social others and natural and designed worlds. Now I'm going to turn to each and explain each very briefly. First, learning is rooted in evolutionary, biological, and neurological systems. Just got a little dark with that slide. Learning is a pervasive and fundamentally human activity that arises out of our biological need to be connected to social others and to adapt to the environment. As just one example, human adaptability is underscored by evidence from the neurosciences, which find that not only are human brains malleable, but the brain is also quite social. We learn from implicit and observational stimuli. In fact, our brains are hardwired to learn implicitly and observationally from others, and to do so from a place of emotional connection. So even those systems we viewed as organic, biological, neurological, and evolutionary systems are social and cultural at their very nature. Learning is also integrated with all other aspects of development: cognition, emotion, and the formation of identity. Mary Helen Imordino Yang writes, "Our schools tend to be preoccupied with what kids know and can do. However, it seems to be how kids think and feel, their dispositions of mind and heart, that have the strongest effect on their learning, civic engagement, personal well-being, and even brain development. There's a substantial body of research underscoring this point. When a sense of belonging and emotional safety are present, and when identities, including racial identities, are integrated into the classroom, learners are better able to engage and learn." It is also important to recognize what happens when this isn't true. Membership in marginalized gender, racial, ethnic, disability status, language proficiency, and immigration status groups can mean that one must manage environments that are not set up to meet one's developmental needs, and indeed, sometimes are designed to reinforce marginalization by not meeting those needs. For example, my own work has noted the conundrum facing Black boys during adolescence, precisely when adolescents have developmental needs for competence and autonomy, care and community, a sense of identity and place in the world. They are too often treated in schools with suspicion as the other and are met with a profound lack of care. The big point here is that this psychosocial development is integral to learning, not a nice to have that layers on top of a set of universal cognitive processes. Learning is also shaped in everyday life practices across the life course. So this one is rather obvious, though we rarely attend to it in schools. Learning happens in many settings, including and beyond schools. This perspective acknowledges that learning unfolds on multiple pathways across lives at once, and that learning at its best is a tapestry where what is learned in one setting, like communities, is expanded and built upon in another setting, like schools, in ways that honor and enrich the experiences of learners. And yet, learning is not neutral. We are more willing to see learning and practices associated with formal learning spaces and less inclined to see the complexity of the learning that occurs elsewhere. Learning settings are power-laden, historically located, and weighted with complex histories. What we learn, the curriculum, the core ideas embedded within it, and who we learn from is not neutral. Thus, learning must be viewed as occurring ubiquitously and as being naturally occurring in people's lives. At the same time, we recognize the ways we silo and privilege school learning, often to the exclusion of a range of ways of being and knowing that show up life-wide. Finally, we recognize that we experience the world through our bodies and through representations. Uses of the body and of representational systems like language, as well as nonverbal communication such as gesture, eye gaze, bodily orientation, joint attention, and the negotiation of meaning, are key to how learning activity is organized and coordinated. This includes language, which relates to learning in many ways. It's both a direct mediator of learning, and it functions to position learners into identities, which thus operates as a tool by which power is instantiated and negotiated. These embodied and representational aspects of learning matter for the kinds of learning settings we would optimally design. So if we know what learning is, and we hold at core this complex, multifaceted, adaptive conception of learning, and we take seriously that identity, emotion, and social engagement are core to learning, then how would we teach? And how would we create education and learning systems to support this kind of learning? It is important as we think about building systems to note, again, that our systems were not designed with this kind of learning in mind, and were certainly not designed for all students to learn. Linda Darling-Hammond sums it up as follows: the belief that only some students are worthy of investment and that students need to be ranked and sorted according to their different levels of potential is deeply rooted in the organizational design of our schools, our funding priorities, our testing and grading policies, and our system of tracking students. If we are thinking about the public function of schooling, the notion that experiences of education should be designed to support our multicultural democracy, then we must also think about the kinds of skill sets and mindsets that people need to be engaged and critical participants in that democracy. This was the focus of a recent National Academy of Education report that Carol chaired, tying learning in the disciplines to civic engagement. Here again, the kinds of learning we support, critical reading and writing, understand and evaluating sources of evidence, the ability to take others' perspectives, matter to our very ability to educate for participation in a multicultural democracy. But what should such education and learning systems look like? In a recent series of articles that ran in the Phi Delta Kappan, we at Spencer invited scholars to imagine the kinds of education systems we could create with a time horizon of 25 years if we put equity at the core. I encourage you to read that set of amazing papers and the responses from others in the field. The articles taken together articulate a vision that includes a K-12 curriculum designed to prepare all young people for civic engagement, written by Carol Lee, equitable systems of assessment grounded in cultural theories of learning, centering student work, connecting families, communities, and school, written by Bill Penuel, schools that respect the agency and diversity of learners, provide purposeful, connected, and authentic learning, and create learning communities that model the society we want, written by John Mehta. Engaging community-based leadership in schools and districts, and honoring family and community as learning partners, written by Ann Ishimaru. Disrupting the reproduction of normal teaching practice, diversifying teaching and humanizing teaching practice, written by Deborah Ball. And finally, a piece on the policies that foster all of the above to be brought into fruition, written by Linda Darling-Hammond. This set of papers sets an ambitious and exciting vision. But here is the thing about an exciting vision, especially one that breaks with what we have done in the past. The very act of imagining can spark a kind of cognitive backlash, right? Rooted in the way things are now, the way things have always been, and in the technical constraints of the current system. Creating something new will require a radical imagination to think something better is actually possible. The faith to believe we can use our power to bring it into being, and the will, the collective will, to do it. There's been promising work over the last few years by some innovative groups thinking about how we build on the science of learning and development and our commitments to engage to an equitable multicultural democracy to design learning systems in alignment with these values and goals. Here, I've represented the frameworks from two of these groups, the SOLD Alliance and the Bell Framework for Equitable Learning, coming out of the Bell Network. Both of these frameworks underscore several key features of education and learning systems that support rich, culturally sustaining, and rigorous learning. They call for new types of relations with families and communities, centering rigorous and rich learning, critical intellectual skills and mindsets, safety, belonging, and cultural affirmation and love, transform systems for discipline and restorative justice and shared power, positive developmental relationships, spaces for identity development. These principles infuse both teaching practices in the classroom, for instance, culturally affirming pedagogy and curricula, intellectually rich, relevant, and challenging instruction, as well as school-level organizational features, looping, detracking, teacher learning communities, restorative justice practices. There's so much more to say here about each of these frameworks and the kinds of practices and structures that they elaborate, but for my purposes here today, I'll leave it at these high-level features of equitable learning systems. These offerings for how we can redesign our education systems are compelling and provide a roadmap. Gloria Ladson-Billings cautions us, however, that this work is about more than techniques and structures and must entail a consideration of the underlying beliefs that teachers and school systems hold about young people. Writing about the extraordinary teachers that she studied, she writes, Rather than techniques or teaching strategies, I learned that what the teachers shared was a set of underlying beliefs that drove their teaching, a set of beliefs about themselves and others, about how to structure social relations, about the nature of knowledge. These beliefs help teachers focus on improving student learning, cultivating critical competence, and supporting socio-political and critical consciousness. I could ignore the actual strategy, lecture, discussion, cooperative groups, etc., and more clearly see how the belief systems were driving what and how they taught. Importantly, this set of beliefs begins with and centers an asset view of students, their families, and their communities. All of this classroom and school-level work requires a set of enabling conditions, or aspects of the ecology of learning spaces and systems that all must be pulling in the same direction. That broader ecology must involve the teacher pipeline, accreditation requirements, pre- and in-service development, recruitment, retention, wellness. It must involve relations with communities and families to be reimagined, multi-tiered systems of engagement and support. It requires adequate and equitable funding to schools and districts. It requires school and district practices to support racial integration within and across neighborhoods, diverse curricular, access to ethnic studies courses. It involves a broader sense of a learning ecology, inclusive of after-school, community, and summer experiences. And it involves vastly different approaches to assessment, supportive accountability, and continuous improvement systems. One could give a lecture on any one of these boxes, and indeed many of you could, so there's no way to do justice with them here. But I just want to call out that in many of these areas, for example, assessment, we are in a kind of renaissance moment where many are realizing that what we've done isn't working well, and there's been a call, both from practitioners and scholars like Ed Gordon, Bill Penuel, Bob Mislivy, Jim Pellegrino, Randy Bennett, for the kinds of assessment systems that align with what we know about learning, which contribute to equity rather than double down on inequity. It's important to note that building the kinds of education and learning systems that we've been discussing require us to lean into a solidarity dividend framed of the kind Heather McGhee articulates. In other words, when education systems are designed not to hoard opportunity for an elite subset, but rather to value the ways of being and learning of young people in multiple communities, then we all win, in the form of better and more fully educated people prepared to take on the challenging social and scientific challenges of our time. And we must note that bringing such systems into fruition is both a matter of what we know from the science, but also a matter of political will. It is entirely clear that the current system will not carry us into the future as a nation, and the question is, are we willing to fully engage schools as a key aspect of building a true multicultural democracy? Okay, this last part is a bit tricky. I want to share with you some thoughts about how we, as a research community, might act in service of this goal to building equitable learning systems. But before I get there are a couple things I need to acknowledge. First, we know from the historical record that communities of color have a troubled history with research. That includes the glaring examples we know well, such as in medical research, like the Tuskegee experiments, but also the smaller scale harms, such as in education research, where scholars misrepresented or misunderstood families, communities, and teachers, or developed and implemented harmful interventions, or where studies perpetuated negative stereotypes. Research has been used in disingenuous ways, in ways that exploit communities and young people, which Joyce King has referred to one version of this as the data plantation. And when we do learn something important and implementable from research, it's not as if it gets taken up into education systems and implemented. For instance, we've long known about the ill effects of high-stakes testing at the scale we do it in this country, or punitive discipline practices, and yet we remain committed to those practices in far too many places. We also have a robust database on the tremendous benefits of culturally affirming and sustaining approaches, yet we are moving in the opposite direction and even legislating against these practices. My point is that good research tells us many things we don't act on for the betterment of schools or learning or students, particularly students of color. And so I don't want to pretend that if we do more good research with relevant findings, that will mean those findings will automatically get taken up into practice. Research use has a political dimension as well and is, again, about power and upholding systems that maintain privilege. So I enter this part of the conversation gingerly, with all of these caveats in mind. In some ways, preparing for this talk has led to an almost existential set of conundrums for me. Can schools that were founded on principles of exclusion and oppression be redeemed, transformed? And similarly, can a research field with traditions rooted in exploitation and neglect for young people and communities that are most marginalized be rebirthed to something fundamentally different than that? And can we imagine a world where policy supports what we know from research, even as we find ourselves in an era of the declining significance of evidence? If the answer to those questions is a resounding no, then we can all go home right now. So for me, the answer has to be yes. Our collective belief in that yes is why we are here. Why we are here and why we are here. And if that's the case, then we have to give rise to an ethic of research and a way of doing our work that is in alignment with and in service to the kinds of deep and rich learning supported by systems committed to the equity we've been discussing. So that's where I'm starting from. And from that place, the task of determining a direction for education research in support of equitable systems will mean that we need to focus on, one, the kinds of scholarship we are producing as a field, and two, to the issue of research use and utilization and knowledge mobilization. The parts of it that are about some of our research habits not being aligned with what we say our goals are, and the part of it that are about how power operates and what research gets taken up and what doesn't. So while keeping these caveats in mind on one hand, I want to share a few thoughts about how our scholarship at a field level might be better equipped to support transformations to education systems in the service of learning. Research, in an ideal world, has many potential uses when it comes to thinking about the impact on policy, practice, and knowledge building. In the public sphere, we've recognized only some of these roles for research. We typically think about the uses of research in the first 3 or 4 bullets on this list, right? To understand what works for whom, under what conditions, and why, though we focus far too much on the what and much less on the whom, under what conditions, and why. We understand that research is important to describe existence-proof cases of the kinds of practice we want to see, and to find key levers for improvement within systems or classrooms, the kind of how we tinker with the current systems to make them better. And to some degree, we understand that research informs design, practice, and policy at a general level. But we less often include these last bullets to offer conceptual insight on an issue or problem. For instance, philosophy approaches that offer new ways of thinking about what the public means in public education. To understand how things came to be, for instance, historical approaches that point out the pitfalls or innovations from the past that we might learn from. And to question assumptions and reimagine possibility, that is to help us think about things anew. I'm just arguing here that we must hold the full range of purposes of education research in mind and thus broaden how we think about and define research usefulness. There are some ways we do our work as a field that are not well aligned with building education systems for learning. And this list may not be exhaustive. This slide and the next were influenced by the recent National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report, The Future of Education Research at IES, chaired by Adam Gamron. This first is what I'm calling here siloing and divergence. Siloing is simply a way of being in the academy. One version of that is that we are trained into the habits of speaking to and working with very narrow circles of specialists, rather than speaking and working more broadly. Our studies are also methodologically and conceptually siloed at times. For example, quantitative studies on educational disparities too often fail to engage critical or rich theories of race to make sense of those disparities. Divergence is our habit to point out differences rather than to find points of convergence or similarity. It's kind of a habit of mind. This prevents consensus and field-level insights that could be really powerful. Disconnection here is another form of siloing. Siloing inside the ivory tower, away from the rest of the world, the disconnection of the academic enterprise from places where scholarship could and does matter. For example, designing studies without stakeholder input of relevant communities of practice, teachers, parents, students, or focusing too often on individual studies or individual researchers rather than field-level knowledge or programs of research. Overemphasis on intervention models. Well, this is rather obvious. We used to think of that research made its way into practice by piloting successful interventions that would get adopted more widely because of their success and would scale up. Turns out it's much more complicated than that, and traditional models of dissemination are insufficient. Even useful interventions require a broader and deeper understanding of how practitioners make use of research findings, how educational products are developed and adopted, and the political process by which knowledge is mobilized from research. Short-term and small-scale studies. Partially because of the way our funding structures work, we think about projects on a 3 to 5 year time horizon, which makes most of our work relatively short-term, and again, due to limited funding structures, relatively small scale. Not to mention geographically clustered in regions where there are more research universities, which undersamples the kind of small and rural districts most students in this country attend. And given this, there are some research habits we need to strengthen as a field. As we've been discussing, equity and the lack thereof is a core issue plaguing American education. Our scholarship must take up these issues of equity as a central and abiding question and view it as a fixable challenge, meaning we have to believe we can do something different and work from an imperative to do so. So when I say we need equity-centered research, I mean not just the questions we take up, but throughout the research process, attending to both topic and how we do our work, from the conceptualization of projects and programs of research to the research questions and including the design, methods, measures, constitution of the research team, etc. It also means shifting the power dynamics between the researcher and the researched. Key in this work is that our work must view communities and people with an asset lens. The second research habit we need to strengthen is to build our collective muscle for collaborative, interdisciplinary, and integrated research across field and subfield, across methodological approach. This means doing our work in collaboration with scholars from other disciplines and with complementary skill sets and perspectives to help us reach beyond the limits of our own perspectives, disciplines, and methods. This could also mean collaborating with those outside of the research community in new ways to design and enact research informed by stakeholders in relation to the needs of teachers, communities, schools, and families. For me, this also calls for more regularly offering research syntheses around key policy and practice relevant topics, clear syntheses of what we do and do not know from research, and attending to the strength of our evidence. It also calls for us to view our work fundamentally as a whole body, where we are together building a cumulative body of scholarship that builds, expands, and deepens over time, where we orient to how we are building on what has come before, rather than at times focusing too much on how our work stands apart, which sometimes means we might just point to a colleague and say, well, she said. We must engage one another's work with a deep respect for heterogeneity. The third research habit we need to strengthen is to make more ambitious studies the norm. This means expanded outcomes and measures, including those at school and system levels, and those that align with more complex notions of teaching and learning. We need more longitudinal work, comparative work, larger scale studies integrating conceptual work with ambitious empirical work. And I don't just mean quantitative work here, I mean mixed methods and qualitative studies. In learning research in particular, we tend to study snippets of learning over very short time horizons. We need bigger investments over the life so we can study learning over the life course and across settings. And finally, a research habit we need to strengthen is to focus on implementation and systems change. It is critically important that we understand the policy system, the governance structures, laws and regulations that shape our schools, and the ways that systems operate at the federal, state, district, and school levels in response to these. Without this understanding, we tend to exhort educators to do things they are constrained from doing without getting to the root of the problem that holds inequitable and disempowering education in place. There is some evidence our field is moving in some of these directions. As one example, there's a litany of long-standing and emerging research methods that fall under the banner of improvement research. I'm going to mispronounce the name, Donald Pirac, Jennifer Lynn Russell, and Laura Cohen-Vogel, I'm sorry, Donald, and Bill Penuel just released a handbook codifying this work into a field. Improvement research refers to methodological approaches that are community engaged, whereby scholars work alongside and in partnership with schools, district teachers, and our community-based organizations to work iteratively on a problem of practice that the school or system or teacher is facing. And while this work is happening in our field, it lacks full structural support. If we are to embrace these ways of working as a field, then we also must consider the ecology of education research. To enact the kinds of research habits I've described, we also need to attend to research training. The ways of doing research have rather obvious, these ways we've been talking about, have rather obvious implications for research training. This includes reconsidering the training experiences scholars need to do the kinds of collaborative, interdisciplinary, and deeply connective research that have been outlined here. Academic incentives. Okay, well, needless to say, we have our work cut out for us here. More collaborative, interdisciplinary, and relevant research will need nurturing structures to hold it. And in many cases, university life fosters exactly the opposite. Our incentive structures in the academy privilege unique contributions, not how we build on each other's work as a field. And we must address the incentive structures in the academy and norm new kinds of scholarship and ways of working. We also need to address the larger national and international infrastructure for research and development, the way that research findings can result in curricula, pedagogies, educational products, or systems that excel. Quite simply, for this kind of work to become the norm, we will need to invest in building more robust structures to support ambitious studies, including investing in federal, state, and local research and development capacity, quote, to support a culture of continual improvement towards creating systems that are aligned with science and design for equity. That's from the IES report. This will also mean structures that support our field to work with grassroots organizers, families, and communities to ensure that the kinds of reforms we are working on are the ones that communities want to see, so that we are working alongside communities and not simply on their behalf in their absence. And finally, funding. The funding of education research needs to be vastly increased, with more education funders funding research as a part of their strategy and more federal investment in education research. And funders need to align RFPs and expectations with some of the future directions outlined here and elsewhere, including a focus on funding scholarship that utilizes asset and solidarity dividend lenses. The vision I've shared with you all today will require more intentional coherence and collaboration on multiple levels. It will also require another kind of intention, one rooted in creating loving systems. And so I'll end where I started. We are having a collective moment in education. It is one of those rare moments, not unlike where we are with climate change or racial injustice, where it seems clear that our choice is to do the same thing and perish, or figure out a new way of being and doing so that we might all thrive. It is time for radical hope and for collective action. Thank you.
For a minute. No long conclusion, but that is the template for the future. One more round of applause for a great president, a great intellect, and a great leader.